class inequality. It's also about identity, other identity-based inequalities, the discrimination and the inequalities that leaves LGBTIQ groups fearful when they go into the public, not knowing whether they will be thrown out of their homes by a homophobic landlord, or that their children experimenting or even declaring their sexual preference will be expelled from school and not be given the option of a transfer. Or that a hate bill would be finding its way through Parliament, as it is in Kenya today, and threaten a large number of people, not just those who are LGBTIQ, but also heterosexual cis individuals who, by that law, will have to report a lesbian niece or a gay nephew to the nearest police station, or fear the possibility of arrest themselves. This is the bill that's going through the Kenyan Parliament at the moment. I'd like you also to think about the elderly, the widows who are currently being stripped of the last vestige of land that they have prematurely, even before that they have died. Their families are essentially targeting them for this small 0.2% of a hectare. Or the women that are fearful and the girls that are fearful of femicide. So with that slightly somber note, let me remind you that polycrises are poly-opportunities. They are really calls to action, not just because we have an obligation to the generation that we are, next generation, to make sure that they do not have to deal with the kind of stuff that our ancestors dealt with several years ago. So with that note, I'm going to very warmly welcome onto the stage, and I'm going to leave some of the announcements for the session after the panel. But we have a great day, and lots of what you saw yesterday will continue today. Let me help me invite Danny and Vidya to the stage to help us reimagine what a transformed wealth creation, management, and distribution system could look like. Welcome to the next panel, Reimagining Wealth, Unveiling the Dynamics of Wealth Creation and Distribution.
Thank you very much, Irungu. Good morning, everyone. My name's Danny Sriskandaraja. I'm currently Chief Executive of Oxfam, Great Britain. I used to be at Civicus, and I'm a big fan of wings. Not chicken wings, not plain wings, although they're good, but networks of a grant maker support, because in many ways, for the last 20 years, almost all of my professional career, I've been a consumer of philanthropy, a grantee, a recipient of philanthropic investments. And the work that Wings and the member organizations do to try to improve the quality of philanthropy is fantastic. And I've been involved in some of these conversations, and it's great to be back in person, meeting lots of old friends, seeing lots of familiar faces, and also reassuring to hear, as I've already been told by Chris Warman this morning, that philanthropic networks continue to self-flagellate. So it's good to hear that some things never change. And I do think it's better that you all self-flagellate than self-congratulate. But I hope we can have a useful and insightful conversation this morning. It's billed as a fireside chat. There's neither a fire here, nor is it really exactly a chat here in person, because this is going to be a hybrid fireside chat between Vidya Shah, who's from the Edelgive Foundation, a renowned philanthropist in India and globally. And Marlene Engelhorn is joining us online. I think you can see Marlene on the screen over there. Marlene, can you see Vidya and me?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So it's going to be a fireside chat, and it's going to be interactive. And we're going to get into questions around wealth creation, management, and redistribution, as Irungu has hinted. Before I start, who happened to be at the Ariadne conference in Paris in, I think, late 2018? Am I right? Anyone? Was it 2018? It's a wonderful conference of European philanthropic networks. I had the privilege of being at that event, and I wore the same T-shirt. So if you can see my T-shirt, it says "Fight Inequality." And I wore this T-shirt in 2018 to a network of European philanthropists because in 2018, I and many other colleagues from Oxfam and different bits of civil society were deeply worried about what we were calling an inequality crisis. You might remember that around 2013, 2014, Oxfam started publishing an annual inequality report, launched at Davos every January. And you might remember that in that report and subsequent reports, there are some shocking statistics about the nature of inequality in the world. The most shocking of which at the time was that a handful of men, all men, I think it was about 10 or 12 at the time, 12 men owned more wealth than the bottom half of the world's population put together. And we and others were saying, how can this be acceptable that in the early part of the 21st century, having made such progress on fighting poverty, on increasing prosperity, that we were now in a world with such deep inequality. But looking back, 2018 was nothing compared to where we are today. And why do I say that? It's because in the deep, dark years of the global COVID-19 pandemic, when many of us thought this was going to be the great leveler, that humanity was going to pull together at this moment of crisis for us as a species, and we were going to finally intervene to redraw the equality map, that we would come together as humanity, know that we are in this together, we'd protect the most vulnerable, we would care for each other, we would take social protection seriously. Have we seen that? No. Please read any of the recent Oxfam reports, and you'll see that what was already a crisis is deepening. In the 2 years or so of the global pandemic, from March 2020 to March 2022, were there more billionaires created or fewer billionaires created in that period? Anyone want to have a guess? Just shout. More. How many more? According to Forbes. Several thousand. Several thousand. One a day. Every 26 hours during the pandemic, a new billionaire was created. 2/3 of all new wealth created on the planet by human beings in those 2 years went to the richest 1%. That rate of accumulation outstripped the previous rate. In those 2 years, the world's billionaires, again, this is all data from Forbes and Credit Suisse and others, the world's billionaires in those 2 years of the pandemic accumulated more wealth than the previous 14 years put together. And so I wear this T-shirt because I remember wearing it in 2018, going sort of thinking, oh my gosh, should I wear a T-shirt like this to a philanthropy conference? And in 2023, I feel I need to wear more than this to wake people up to the inequality crisis. Why does that matter to this session? I think it matters because those of us who work in and around philanthropy, whether we are a consumer, a philanthropist, or in networks of grant maker support, I think do have to engage with the question of this sort of the spectrum, the journey, if you will, between wealth creation, management, and redistribution. And it's not a conversation that I think happens often enough, and it doesn't happen in a sort of constructive and deep way. And we're only going to have an hour, so we're not going to get that deep, but I hope we can be provocative and constructive. But before we get to that conversation, I want to ask a quick question that I'm going to ask now, and I'm going to ask at the end of the session. So I'm going to give you a choice, three choices, and I'd like you to put your hand up. You can vote for more than one choice. So the problem, as I've just laid it out, is we're in a world where inequality is rising, wealth is being created at an eye-watering pace, accumulated by some. Philanthropy is a boom industry, right? Every day, $2.7 billion a day is how much net wealth increases of the world's billionaires. So you're in a boom industry, because even if you get a part of that extra wealth, do you think your role in grant that you are going to just nudge a little bit? Or third, you're the revolutionary, that you actually think your job is to burn it all down, politely, professionally, but your job is to end philanthropy as we know it, because it's much better to have a much more equal society in the world where we wouldn't have philanthropy. So, 2-2, nudge, revolution. This is where you, at the start of the conversation I want to take, this is not a scientific poll, but who sees themselves in category 1? No one, Marlene. I can report. Okay, who sees themselves as in category 2? Okay, about half of the group here. Irungu's not. You're on the. He's on the fence once again, Irungu. Who's in the third category? Okay, a smaller number than the second category. Okay, we're going to come back to this question at the end of the session. So it is fantastic to have Vidya and Marlene here for this discussion. Vidya, perhaps you can tell us just a little bit about Edelgive Foundation and what you do, please.
Yeah, so I actually come from a middle-class family. I've spent all my life in Mumbai, in India, and I think acutely aware of the privileges I had in terms of access to great education at reasonable cost, largely because of the work that many people had done before in terms of establishing educational institutions that offered a whole bunch and continue to offer a whole bunch of middle-class Indians the opportunity to move ahead in life. And fast forward, I began my career in investment banking almost 35 years ago, and then joined my husband in establishing a financial services group called Edelweiss also in Mumbai. One of the founding principles we had was that we would start giving the moment we made sustainable profit. We were a very small company. I was the 10th employee when I joined. And in the first 5 years, there was a semblance that there is something credible and sustainable here in terms of our business. And the task of going out and finding great NGOs to partner with was given to me. And I had absolutely no clue. My whole career until then had been in financial services. I was acutely aware of the inequalities, but that was because of the kind of person I am, more than any formal exposure. But I think those 3 years before I set up Edelgive Foundation, 4 years before I set up Edelgive Foundation, where I traveled across India and met a lot of organizations, was kind of life-changing for me. And I was really struck not only by the immense amount of work that community-based organizations were doing in India, but also by the fact that there was just nobody worrying about building capacity and capability in the sector. And the only conversation from funders was around scale and how do you grow, and you're just working for 500 children, why can't you work for, what will it take for you to do 5,000 and 500,000, without really, going through the layers of what it takes to build organizations that can truly scale in the sector. So I was acutely aware, but maybe because I come from a business background that doesn't see this as an issue, doesn't see, the building the back end as being different from building a business. And that is not the case in the sector. So when we went public as a company, I decided to step down from my business role and actually set up the foundation. We had an incredibly supportive board at the company who permitted us, in a sense, to go ahead and really pledge at that time 2% of our pre-tax profits to philanthropy. 5 years later, of course, India went through this, I think in some ways, groundbreaking regulation that mandates all companies above certain profit threshold to give more or less an equal number. But I think the genesis of the foundation was not just to be able to identify great partners on the ground and truly work with them on their journey to become more effective, not just to scale, but to become more effective in their work. That was really the genesis. That was really and it came a little bit from naivete, I think, from a lack of exposure. But I think the journey over the last 15 years since we set up the foundation formally in 2008 has been one of great learning and great humility in being able to identify these amazing organizations in India with whom we continue to work in an extremely partnership-oriented way.
Brilliant, thank you. That sounds like a remarkable and inspiring journey. And just to confirm Vidya's credentials, I did check with a very senior colleague in civil society in India about what he had to say about Vidya, and he said she is a really good person, believes in bottom-up processes, respects the person on the ground. I like her. So I trust this person's judgment, and so I'm very delighted to be here. Marlene, I don't know anyone who knows you, but I did last night watch a fantastic TEDx talk that you gave in Vienna earlier this year, and I highly recommend it, not just for the messages that you convey, that I hope you can talk about a bit this morning, but because you took the Salt and Pepper song, Let's Talk About Sex Baby, and adapted it to be relevant to philanthropy. So, Marlene, maybe you could tell us what you did with the song, but more importantly, a little bit about you and your journey and the work you're doing at the moment.
Okay. Hello, I hope you can hear me. Just let me know.
Perfect, yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for having me, although I can't see anyone other than you. I'm sorry. So what I did is I took the song. I'm not a good singer at all. I'm not going to sing for you. For anyone who was like, oh, we're going to get a performance, I will disappoint greatly because I can't sing. But I did Let's Talk About Tax Baby, because I think that philanthropy has to acknowledge its political role, and that means as soon as you talk any kind of redistribution, be it voluntarily in terms of philanthropy or structurally, you have to have the whole conversation, and so you can't not talk about tax. And so for me, I was born into an extremely wealthy family with German background that got rich through the chemical and pharmaceutical industry, first BASF until the end of the 19th century, and then Boehringer Mannheim until the end of the 20th century. And when the company was sold, Boehringer Mannheim that is, late 90s, my family became insanely rich and is insanely rich to this day. And that's also due to the fact that there is no significant taxation that prevents this sort of wealth accumulation that is purely linked to owning something, whether or not you work in that setting, being completely irrelevant. And having to deal with this, I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And the options I got presented were philanthropy or impact investing, both of them being absolutely unsatisfying. Because in both particular scenarios, I was to be in the power position. Because of what, again? Right, because I was born into the right family, something that you can greatly fight for, right? It's pure luck. And I think luck and birth should not be the factors that determine your status, your power, your privilege in any way. We are so much past this. Societies at this point can really structure themselves differently. We have chosen, and I'm saying abroad, we here, and I know I usually only speak within Austria, and at this point I want to enlarge that we to white Western Europe, because that is something that I can somewhat represent, I will guess. There are democracies that can be created. People know that they can seize power and use it to create their own societies, their own worlds, according to what they need. Nobody needs to tell them that. And so there is no need for super wealthy power positions like the one I was born into. And the only way to address this in a structural way where there's already a foundation in terms of discourse, to me, that I found, was to go into tax advocacy work and to go public and talk about how important it is to consider that money is a system of circulation. Money is a means. It's not just something, like it only becomes something when you use it, or when you hoard it in a particular way, it becomes an asset of power. And so to regulate the distribution is really, really a key to, by that, influence power distribution as well. And so taxes have become one of my favorite subjects of all time, even though it's not really the party trick when you go, oh, I like to talk about taxes, and people go like, let's hear. That doesn't ever happen. But I get a lot of attention because I'm rich, I'm white, I'm privileged, and I get every stage that I want in order to talk about how important it is to tax people like me, so that they can't be born into super wealthy families, because everybody's going to be a good family, and because birth is not the key factor to how powerful and how well off you are in a society anymore. This transition takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. There's no such thing as easy work in a democracy, because everybody needs to be on board, not just the stakeholders that are already powerful, but everybody else. Narratives have to be shifted. It's a lot of work, it's a lot to ask, especially from those who have been suffering from marginalization, from structural discrimination for years and centuries. So bringing the tax subject to any philanthropic event that will have me, like this morning, thank you, by the way, I think is key to understand that the only real role that philanthropy has, given the fact that it is a voluntary redistribution by the super wealthy, is to abolish itself. Because a world that doesn't need philanthropy anymore will be a world that is much more equal, and I think preferable to the one that we're in now. And to tackle this consequently and honestly, and knowing that it will take time, but not refraining from taking first steps, is something that I hope that this panel can inspire everyone here who's not already on board to bring into their own particular philanthropic setting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marlene. That's... You've got some spontaneous applause in case you can't hear it. This is a tough crowd to get that from, so well done. And you've clearly laid out the case for the third position in the choices I gave. And by the way, if you do catch the TEDx talk, Marlene has some brilliant sound bites. There's nothing super about the super rich, and you deliberately change high net worth individual to high net wealth individual, which I thought was an important distinction that you draw on. Vidya and Marlene, let's maybe just step back in time a little bit, because all societies have had wealth, wealthy people have created wealth, accumulated wealth. India has a long tradition of philanthropy, dating back hundreds, maybe thousands of years.
Yeah.
How do you see wealth in the Indian context today, and historically, what role has it played? Are things changing about how wealth is perceived?
Yeah, it's been very interesting if you look from a deep historical perspective. Like yesterday, we learnt about the African continent and the deep tradition of everyday philanthropy, of ordinary people helping each other. There's been, I think, similar traditions across the world. India was an incredibly wealthy country, and at that time, I think the model of philanthropy was that of patronage. And the rich were expected to be patrons of the arts, of artisans, build hospitals, schools, museums. So it was a culture of patronage. And despite all the hate debate in India today with minorities, I think the Mughal era was one of the most prosperous eras, because despite the fact that it was a Hindu majority country even then, the Muslim rulers actually had a deep tradition of inclusivity and patronage, and a lot of the administration was actually Hindu. So I think this tradition of patronage pretty much percolated down even 200 years ago, or more like 400 years ago, when the British first came and colonized India, where a large part of the freedom struggle was actually funded by philanthropy. In fact, the state of Indian civil society, the richness, even though the chaos, the noise, the courage, the fearlessness, all of it comes, from the freedom struggle. It took us 447 years to get the British out of the country. There is a very famous saying by one of our very prominent women leaders of the time called Sarojini Naidu, who spoke of Gandhiji to say that it takes a lot of money to keep Bapu in poverty. And that was really the tradition. It was the large business houses of the day, and they continue today, like the Birlas and the Tatas, who actually funded a large part of the freedom struggle. But post-independence, I think we went through a period of almost 50 years where we went through a deep economic crisis, and large parts of the world also went through it in the 70s and the 80s. And in that, we had the tradition of huge multilateral and UN organization involvement in bringing, Indians out of poverty. And there was a certain culture of philanthropy that got kind of set up at that time, where the rich actually continued patronage. I think all of the large private hospitals, educational institutions, across the board, temples, other places of religious worship were all funded through philanthropy. But in terms of direct service delivery, which is either education or health, that was not something that philanthropy was at the forefront of. And the service delivery model effectively got taken up by contractors in civil society, who then went on to work for these multilaterals. And there was a certain tradition of a culture of, application orientation, 5%, 10%, or costs added on. So it was a contracting system, which I think, perhaps was not as good as it should have been at that time, but I don't think philanthropy really existed in a meaningful way. But cut forward to the 90s, when we saw the spate of economic reforms in India, and you've seen now, because of the technology dominance by Indian firms globally, there's been incredible wealth generation starting from the 90s through to today. And there is, I think, an organic indigenous form of philanthropy that has developed. The West has applied labels to it, but there has been an indigenous way. So there has been a technocratic approach. It's worked very well. If you look at India Stack, large parts of Africa are now looking at India Stack as a way of reaching to the absolute poor, in terms of government schemes being available, identity, mobility, safety, all of that, and most importantly, financial inclusion. But there's also been, which now the world calls trust-based philanthropy, which is a lot of people like me and my incredible peers in India who really believe that there has to be ground-up change. If change has to be sustainable, if change has to be long-term, it is communities who have to, who have to take charge, and we from the outside have to nudge, enable, and not go in and say, we have the solutions for you, do it this way, which was a little bit of the multilat approach, that this is the way to do things. And then, of course, there is the CSR, which has emerged as a significant funder, perhaps to the tune of, I would say, $3 to $4 billion a year, which companies generate in terms of their CSR allocations, which is tends to follow the more safer, mandated approach. And unfortunately does a more of the service delivery kind of work, which is, you set up more, you enable either government schools to perform better, or you work directly in education through teacher training, or you set up more hospitals, in especially looking at tertiary care, which is a huge problem currently in India, or you look at, livelihood, employment, employability kind of creation. So there's this incredibly, I think, a place of churn currently in philanthropy, where we're really trying to figure out what is the best way that philanthropy can truly add value. But I think just in terms of the angst or the anger or the frustration against the rich, which we see in other parts of the world, we're not seeing, interestingly, in India. And that's perhaps because we, unlike Germany and what Marlene spoke about, I think we're already at a fairly high tax rate. Capital gains gets taxed in India, dividends get taxed in India. They're the major sources of income and wealth for the rich. And in some ways, the rich have also been pretty smart at managing, what they do in terms of philanthropy and patronage in order to be able to stay away from any anger or backlash.
Thank you. Marlene, before I come to you, I just want to say, Vidya, it's remarkable. What you've just said could almost word for word be said at the meeting I'm also here in Nairobi to attend. It's a meeting of all the Oxfam international leadership. We're about 20 minutes down the road. And why I say it's almost word for word is because I don't think the sort of conversations or questions you're raising in philanthropy are unique. We're asking it in the development sector, for example, as well, because if I've understood you correctly, we are a sector that's gone from being a sort of amateur sport, if you will. Development was about a bit of charity here, a project there, maybe some risk-taking, maybe a bit of cash smuggled across a border to support a freedom fighter or whatever else it is. But the last 50 years has seen professionalization, bureaucratization, the arrival of the log frame, or log frame-itis as I often call it. And in some ways, our sector, I assume, like philanthropy, has become better in terms of professionalizing and understanding impact. But the questions we're asking in our sector are much the same. It's, well, is this really making a difference? Are we achieving systemic change? And, it's funny, you were describing in some ways what Peter Buffett called the charitable industrial complex 10 years ago or so. He wrote a very important op-ed in the New York Times. Please read it if you haven't. I think it was about 10 years ago. And he said, the problem is we've walked ourselves into a charitable industrial complex that's making some incremental changes here and there, but isn't addressing the structural injustices and the structural inequalities. And I say that partly to say this is a common challenge for many others in our ecosystem, but also to say, please don't get me wrong, it's not like I'm sitting here saying, oh, us NGOs know exactly what all this is about, and you guys in philanthropy need to sort of catch up. We're all, I think, asking a similar set of questions about managing social impact as sensibly as possible. Let me go back to the running order. Marlene, you talked about, your family having wealth back in the 19th century. What's your take on the sort of history and evolution of wealth creation, the responsibility of wealthy people?
So I don't know the exact origins of wealth. There's an absolute lack of transparency, documentation regarding this. I'm very fearful to find out eventually. I have a couple of people in the family who are trying to figure out what the origins are, to learn as much about where it comes from really, which basically means to know where it was extracted and who was stripped of it in order for my family to be able to hold it and accumulate it in the system that they were in. Pretty sure that this was a cross-border situation, and also considering that the company Boehringer Mannheim, after BASF, survived the Second World War. Which company does that? And how? So there are a couple of very important questions that must be tackled. I can't tackle them alone, like I can do my research, but what am I going to find? And to find people who are able to cooperate in that and actually do substantial research with an actual impact outside of findings in terms of how it inspires others to also question the origins of their wealth. That's a topic that needs more work and is in discussion how to do this properly. And what it really brings to the table for me is, and that's a personal view, I'm not alone with this view, but it's not like I'm backing it on a super theory or something. There is no such thing as absolutely clean wealth. There is no such thing as deserving these absurd extreme amounts, like multi-millions and billions of whatever currency you want to put in here. It's impossible. First of all, because you can't be self-made, which is an argument I hear a lot. It's impossible to be self-made because the first thing you need to be self-made is a system that allows you to found whatever legal body you need for your business or for whatever else you're doing. The next thing is in the very second you employ a person to help you out with the workload because you can't do it alone anymore because you're so successful, right? You're not self-made anymore. That's the very second another person is put in the picture. And now the division is who owns it and who works for it. And that's what settles distribution. Not exclusively, but also. And so, like, thinking this through to the end brings me to the point, wealth is really only created in societies that structure themselves and that have an open structuring process, a democratic one ideally. Like, you can get wealth in non-democratic societies, and don't get me wrong, I know that this is the case in kleptocracies and everything. But if you have already got a societal understanding of sharing, which is the basic of any kind of welfare state structure, and the basis of any kind of democracy that says we're sharing power, right? One vote per person, not one vote per euro, pound, dollar, whatever currency you're in. Then this has to apply also to the state of mind of those who, through the systems of the past, became as rich as they are now, and must acknowledge that really you need to take a step and allow a vacuum of power where you have been, once you've stepped off that throne, by redistributing your wealth, ideally in a participatory way, through philanthropic means if there is no taxation system, but also advocating for tax justice a bit here and there might not be of harm, and to allow for communities to take that place of power, which also means to prepare whatever void you leave in order for communities who are self-governed, who lead their own fight for whatever right they are working for, be it the queer feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, the anti-ableist movement, whichever one comes to mind. And to really help facilitate a much broader, much more equal distribution of wealth, land, and power through acknowledging your role in it, how you've come about your own situation, in case that applies to whatever person considers themselves spoken to when I say you, and how to use that in alliance with those that you want to support, asking them how it makes sense to shift this power, shift this wealth, shift this land if you hold land. And that's be part of a letting go process of the powerful that are really mostly only powerful because of a dynastic transfer of wealth, which is nothing more than the fantasy of a genetic supremacy of your own freaking family. And it's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's the basis of a lot of foundations. And yes, I know they do some good, but also whatever philanthropic foundations really give in terms of actual money to whatever cause is only a fraction of what could be collected through a taxation system that ideally would be governed by a transparent, democratic system. So think about it.
Thank you. Okay. 2 rounds of spontaneous applause. This is unprecedented for a Wings forum, I think.
Thank you.
Vidya, before we get to, we've got some questions already that have come in via the app. Just a quick question to you, because what do you and your family plan to do around, do you plan to create an ongoing foundation in perpetuity, or what's your approach to sort of intergenerational wealth that Marlene is in some ways rallying against?
Yeah, I think, the wealth that my family has been created now in the last few years. There's of course the corporate foundation that we set up 15 years ago, but I have also, and now I have a team that really manages it, a brilliant team that manages it, and I'm the chair. And as I wanted to start transitioning from leading that foundation and enabling the team really to have the autonomy to take forward some of the guiding principles that we set for the foundation, which is continue to keep the nonprofit at the center of our work, and we exist to enable that nonprofit to reach its full potential, and to do it in an extremely engaged way. I also started thinking about what I wanted to do. So I do have, again, a role in the business. I'm chair of the foundation, but I've also set up our family foundation. And I have 2 children, but they know that they're not going to get too much from us, enough as Warren Buffett has famously said, enough to help them survive, reasonably thrive, but not enough to make them want to do nothing. So a large part of our wealth will go into philanthropy. It's already going into philanthropy, and that's the way, at least my husband and I have thought of the future of our wealth.
Is that common to other Indian philanthropists of your generation, that same sort of approach?
I think it is, there are 2 or 3 initiatives, not like the Giving Pledge, because it applies more to people like us who are first generation wealth creators, like I said, aware of the opportunities that India threw at us, and also deeply aware that it was, like Marlene said, sort of an ovarian lottery that enabled us that, because like many of my generation belong to the, I don't like to use the word, but upper castes, and therefore had more opportunities than people who don't belong to the upper castes. But you see it, you definitely see, and therefore there are these initiatives called Living My Promise, which means during your lifetime, not after you're gone. During your lifetime, you try and you pledge and actually give more than 50% of your wealth to philanthropy. But I think I'm seeing that more with people like me who are professionals, who came up in the last few decades. I'm not seeing that with wealth that has sort of been transmitted over generations. I'm not seeing it yet. I am seeing, though, where there are more than 1 or 2 kids in a very, very rich, ultra high net wealth family, it's the second or the third child who's offered the role to manage the philanthropy, and I don't see, unfortunately, too much creativity or innovation coming from there, because the actual autonomy of philanthropy hasn't transferred. Only the, let's say, the intention or to endow, or the intention to actually give to philanthropy has transferred, not the autonomy. And I think a lot more work needs to get done there.
Brilliant, thank you. I really want to get to this question, but Marlene, I want to ask you just quickly, what about your peers, others in your generation who've inherited wealth? Do they make similarly provocative statements and speeches?
Not all of them go public with that. A lot of them are bought into family company situations where they want to change company structures from within, which usually implies that they're not allowed to speak out. But I am connected to a lot of people. This is a slowly but organically growing community of wealth holders through inheritance. Also, a couple of startup people in there who share that view that I have, and some of them also doing public speaking. A colleague of mine that I greatly admire, Stephanie Bremer, for instance, but also various approaches, Sebastian Klein, Anthony Schwartz. There is more people coming and ready for the discussion outside of the classical philanthropic route or the impact investing route to figure out how to approach redistribution of wealth and reduction of substantial sums of wealth. And you might be familiar with Resource Generation USA, Resource Movement Canada, Resource Justice UK, like various groups that organize rich kids like me, if you will, around these questions, not to tell them what to do, but to ask them, where does your money really come from? What are the narratives in your family? How do you approach that? What can you do? How can you take action and not just self-flagellate? All the good that comes from that doesn't necessarily lead to action, but we need action. So yeah. There are other people, thank God. Good.
That's good to hear. And there's Patriotic Millionaires, which is a network that Oxfam and others are involved in as well, which has a report that is also well worth reading, entitled, rather aptly, Taxes, Not Pitchforks. And it really leans into this question that the very social contract on which wealth is being accumulated relies on permission. And taxes are part of that social contract. And if you don't get that right, you end up with, as you've hinted, Marlene, that into sort of social breakdown, pitchforks. So we are in a room in a network that's dedicated to improving grant making, and there's a brilliant question from Sheila Bowler about the sort of the grant maker and advisor dilemma around these issues. So what do we think about including grant makers who've generated wealth that's not aligned with our values? There are some very rich people who've made their money through fossil fuels or tobacco or whatever else. Sheila's question is, do we create spaces without them? Are there situations where it makes sense to bring them on board? Vidya, Marlene, what's your sense? What advice would you have to people involved in philanthropy support in this room?
If maybe Marlene can go first this time.
So when you ask the question where it comes from and you say like tobacco or something, or that the question that is purely asset-based, it should also relate to the work that was done, because the work was created because people worked in the tobacco industry, oil fields, whatever. So there's people's lives and livelihoods involved in this as well. And as much as you can shame someone for still getting oil out of the ground instead of leaving it where it should be, you should acknowledge that there's people who worked for this and that this work, these lives need acknowledgement as well, just to give it a little nuance. And also to then re-question who owns this wealth really. Like legally speaking, the person who owns the company will get the profit, yes. But if people put work in, this is actually wealth that was created by people from a certain society and or community. And you can transfer that back. You don't have to hold on to it. And so to bring these people on board with these negative sources of wealth, if you will, I'm one of these people. I mean, the chemical and pharmaceutical industry, also the history with the Second World War that I have not completely gone through yet, but I'm sure it's going to be awful. Like, I will still redistribute my wealth. And I hope that people can see that even though it wasn't generated in the nicest in industry, it still also came from the work of people and thus needs to be redistributed into these community societies, and to be part of the conversation, to acknowledge that and to bring it to and own it, own up to what you did, and face the criticism that is correct. Like, you should be correctly criticized for that. To say yes, it's true, and I'm sorry, to really apologize, to consider redistributing, taxation, reparation work, and to really like get a spine and be invited for that and be part of changing things. I think it takes a lot of guts from everybody, from those who need to step up and own up to what they did and how they did it, also from those who invite these people and have to face the exploitation, the extraction, the violence that is so often part of this wealth that will then come and get center stage. And it is hard to have to witness that and maybe applaud someone who only got rich because they extracted it from communities, but now figured out, well, this wasn't so cool after all, and now I've got it. So yeah, go you. So this is hard work, really hard work. And I'm really extremely grateful for everybody who puts up with this kind of spotlighting. But I also think that unfortunately we do need to make these connections in order to really transition, because the tax system won't change itself just like that overnight. It needs to be a bottom-up process, a democratic discussion, and it needs to also happen in the philanthropic sector, which means a lot of radical honesty, openness, and criticism, and being able to listen, in terms like I need to listen to people in communities. That has to happen. So I would encourage it, but I would also warn people that this is taking a stroll emotionally and psychologically on a lot of stakeholders here.
Yeah, no, thank you. Vidya, any advice for grant makers in the room?
Yeah, I think I'm also drawing on a lot of the conversations yesterday that we had about generally whether we need philanthropy and what the role of philanthropy can be, and also the speaker in the morning who really spoke about perhaps there's a huge disruption or a huge change that we need, a structural change that is really necessary, which possibly is a 1 in 400, 500 year kind of event if we really want to see a more equitable society. And I think in India, the way at least I and a few of us who are kind of more like-minded are really looking at philanthropy is this this triangle and these relationships between these three primary actors. And in Hindi, we call it Samaj, which is society, Bazaar, which is markets, and Sarkar, which is governments. And the interplay of these three forces is really what leads, or balance among these three forces is what will really lead to progress. And it is when one or the other actor becomes super powerful, and you're seeing a lot of autocratic regimes in government. You're seeing market forces which are not necessarily or mostly not acting in the best interests of the environment in terms of, or for their own employees and the people who work for them. And they become super powerful. It is and if society is weakened because of the various interventions of both government and markets, you will see this skewing. And I see the role of philanthropies to prop up and to build and strengthen the samaj, the society. And that cannot only happen through substituting government when it comes to health delivery or education delivery, which is what most of philanthropy in India at least is doing. It will only happen when we use data, when we use reports like and hold a mirror to the government when it comes to inequalities and data around inequalities, or when we help in building institutions and setting up the necessary foundational elements of any society that enables ordinary citizens to truly make use of their vote. I think that is really the role of philanthropy. And if we just continue to set up a school somewhere or a hospital somewhere, nothing's really going to change. And in terms of structural shifts, a lot of what Marlene is also speaking about and what I'm grappling with is really the relationship with money. How are we looking, especially the rich, how are they looking at their relationship with money? How much is enough? And if we don't, address these questions about how much is enough, what is success, how are we always going to measure success in terms of richness and wealth? And if these fundamental and slightly philosophical questions are not addressed, there's this very famous now writer called Morgan Housel, and he's written this book called The Psychology of Money. I think it's an essential read for a lot of people, especially with wealth, because he's really challenging not only how that wealth was created, but how we live with it, how we work with it, and what is really our relationship with other human beings and the planet. And if we don't ask these questions, we will keep coming back to the same thing, that nothing really changes. The rich, and through philanthropy, continue to do the things that don't necessarily make a long-term change.
Thank you. Now, we've got time for a round of questions, and there are 2 roving mics here that will go around. And I just want to say that I think that's a really powerful way, Vidya, that you've put it, which is, in some ways, philanthropy has an intimate relationship with each of those 3 points in that triangle. We live in an era of what I think of as market extremism, where markets are generating, huge eye-watering levels of wealth, state failure, and philanthropists asked to fill the gaps of where states have failed to provide basic services, and an era in which society, voluntary action, civil society, is also beleaguered. Those who dare speak truth to power are being shut down. And so philanthropy, I think, is a fantastic way of thinking about philanthropy in the middle of that triangle and having to navigate at once all of those dimensions. So thank you for that. We've got some questions from the floor. One there. Yes, please. Irungu, come on, do some work.
The other runner is not a Kenyan, so I'm going to do the thing. We'll need one more person. If you can come forward. And let me give you the second one.
Yeah, we'll do a quick fire round. Please make them questions, not comments.
These are jobs for Ethiopians and Kenyans only.
Yep.
Isn't one of the questions that we really need to ask not a controversial question about fighting or arguing with or debating people who have wealth, bringing more of the wealthy people into rooms like this so that they can actually hear the kinds of things that we're hearing today?
Thank you. Great question. And great modeling of succinct questions.
My question is to Marlene. Who should redistribute wealth through taxation, especially in contexts where governments are corrupt and unreliable?
Mm-hmm. Other questions? No, it's too early on a Wednesday morning to get this crowd. Or you've all stunned them. Okay, well, let's deal with those 2. Should we do more to get wealthy people into rooms like this, having conversations like this? And what about the inefficiencies of the state itself around redistribution? And can we trust the state to that? Who should we be assigning? Vidya, Marlene.
Yeah, I can take the first and perhaps Marlene can take the second. No, I think this is what I always worry about, that am I always speaking in a room full of the converted, people who are on the same wavelength, and is this just an echo chamber of like-minded voices? In July I was in Kigali at the Women Deliver conference, and I think we were just about 5 funders in a room of this size, full of very passionate feminist activists. And I think we got just not short of being physically assaulted. Everything else happened to us, saying that this is what philanthropy doesn't do, doesn't fund movements, but we were just 5 in a room of 200, and we were anyway feminist philanthropists, 5 women, who were already funding the cause, and we were the only ones. So I'm finding that a lot of rooms, we had a funders working table, working meeting a few days ago, and we were all like-minded funders. And the questions I'm now asking is, funders don't seem to come, either by choice or they don't want to come here. I don't know why. Secondly, I think foundation staff and foundation management, there needs to be a lot of strengthening and true autonomy provided there, because if they are going to be the link between the principles and the need to do more effective, more meaningful philanthropy, where is the dialogue? The dialogue doesn't exist. We definitely need more funders in the room, and we need funders who come from a different perspective, not people like me who say things that everybody anyway knows in this room.
Great. Marlene?
I just want to add to that so many funders who have been born into wealth are used to not having to face any sort of criticism, so it's really difficult to get them to really come and not just to flick out of it at the last minute or something. So I guess to create a new situation of how wealth is regarded might be a good nudge for them to then join the rooms that offer them to think critically about their role. But there also must be a climate of not considering wealth something good per se, but to say in order for it to be good, something has to be done with it. What can be done, like these rooms will give you some questions that might help you get on a different path than you might have been on so far. And to the other question regarding state failure, government failure. First of all, state and government are not the same thing. You always have a state. It doesn't matter whether you're democratic or not. You always have a state that is there to manage a large and complex society. And you have government that sits on top of it and that decides and has a responsibility of making decisions so that the state doesn't keep on discriminating the way it does and on causing harm the way it does. But also, what we do have is a much higher level of transparency and control in a democratic situation, that is, than we ever get with any wealthy person. We have absolutely no transparency, we have absolutely no control how they use their wealth and how well they do that. And there's a lot of bullshit happening out there that we just don't know anything about. Some we do, and we frown upon it, but we have no means of accessing the way these decisions are being made. And the state can be worse, perhaps, yes, maybe, I don't know. But I think, in terms of results, if you only look at the results, but I think the process is much better because it at least allows for a certain level of transparency, control, and participation. Whereas wealthy people and the philanthropic industry, most philanthropic institutions don't allow for that, unless they go radically participatory in their grant making. And so, to focus on what the state does with the money that it collects in terms of taxes is really a purely result-focused approach, and it cuts completely short of what needs to be looked at, which is the process, and also to acknowledge that why are states doing that? Who are the people in power? Aren't there a lot of very wealthy people in power? Don't they shape the system according to their wants, needs to enlarge in their wealth and profits? Don't their actions and decisions translate into how the state works? So I think if you take a step back, you can see that the way we have changed society, and by we I mean the wealthy people who have any kind of influence, be it passively or actively used, for the last 40 years, the neoliberal turn on our economic system has really stripped the state of so much potential action-making power, and has really taken resources from the state, for instance, by reducing taxation on wealth. For what? For nothing. LSE, London School of Economics, for 50 years, they looked at 18 OECD countries, asking the question, if you reduce tax on wealth, will it A, increase the economy, like will it lead to growth, and B, lead to trickle down? The result is 0. It leads to neither. So what do we have? People with a lot of money, with no accountability, no transparency, no democratic control, being able to do whatever they want to do with their money, or states where we do not have perfect level of control or transparency. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying the process of the state and democratic process is much to be preferred. And to go in there and to engage democratically means that everybody gets a say in it, whereas when wealthy people are left with the decision, nobody gets a say other than the wealthy themselves. And so the shift must not be to who gets the best result, because that will justify any means, and that is not true. The shift should be which process is the one that we want, because if we shape the process, and if we shape it towards real transparency, participation, inclusiveness, I don't know what the correct noun is, sorry. Real democracy, really like radical democracy, then the result will look according to that process in a different way. So even if the state is not spending perfectly well right now, it can be modeled into it by getting everybody on board, which is never the case with wealthy people, even if they mean the very best, because they can't. They're just one person, and one person cannot have, or let it be a board of 5. They have no idea what everybody needs. They don't have the experience. They must ask people or shift power to those who do know. And why not to a democratic system? Why not build the democracy we want to live in, instead of building the shadow system that fills in the gaps of the system that we're currently in? Why this energy here instead of putting it into an open democracy, an actual democracy? So yes, I know, state does harm, but at least we know it and we can challenge it. Whereas wealth does harm, but it's hardly possible to challenge it, especially when the laws that regulate it are being eroded by the very wealthy themselves and their large army of lobbyists and lawyers.
Brilliant. What a way to finish. Thank you. So we are running out of time. I hope you were sufficiently provoked by that conversation. Thank you to Vidya and Marlene. I thought you were fantastic, authentic, provocative, honest. For me, there are 3 takeaways. One is, I think, Marlene, you and your generation are really asking, as you said, sort of doing the heavy work around inherited wealth or perpetuity, all those concepts we've become very familiar with and often become very complacent about in philanthropy. And it's great that you're asking those questions about what does it mean to have inherited wealth, foundations that live in perpetuity. I think there's a second question about what's happening now. What does responsible ethical philanthropy look like today, especially given that we are living through, another era of immense wealth creation. Add up all of those numbers and the fact that there are relatively low levels of taxes on wealth, then we are in another epoch of philanthropic capital being generated. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is this too much, too little? Is the right amount being created? And then there's a third question around, if we were sitting here in 10 or 20 years' time, would our sector, the sorts of networks that we're in, the actors we're working with, would it look different? Would it just be 5 out of 200? How many of those new billionaires, how many of those 62 new billionaires who created in the last few years who work in the food industry? There are 12 members of the Cargill family that make the Forbes list today. How many of those people will be in conversations like this talking about food security and poverty and famine around the world? So I think there is a question about what will this conversation be different in say 10 years' time. So just quickly, I want to come back to the question I asked you at the start. You get 3 options. Are we here to be the tutu, just clearing money, don't worrying about where it's come from? Anyone who's changed their mind and wants to jump into category number 1? No. Who's in category 2, that your role is to nudge? Hands up, please. Ooh, fewer hands in category 2. And who wants to burn it all down? No, who has a more revolutionary approach as a result of this panel? Okay, a few more hands. All right, I think we've shifted. Okay, Marlene, I think we could guess where you were going to be in that group. But look, thank you very much, Vidya and Marlene. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Danny, Vidya, and Marlene. And let me just say, those of you who are revolutionary, you can't do this. Like Samora Machel would not have accepted that, or Winnie Mandela. You actually have to do this, or like both hands. Okay, let me try that again. Revolutionaries, fist in the air.